Ladies and gentlemen, I am so honored because y'all know how Scott and I plan all this ahead of time. And last night he said to me, and so in the morning, and I said, I don't want to talk about it. The first speaker is Jean Watson. She is a nurse, and I'm introducing her. So just so y'all know that, I voted on myself and I won. So that's the way it is. And so in honor of that, I also told Jean already, I'm asking all the nurses in the audience, stand up right now. And if they're sleeping off the dancing, I get it. But nurses, please stand up. Thank you. We've been honored several times by people who have said, and the doctors ran in and told me, and the nurses were there the whole time. So I can tell you, as a nurse, I went back to graduate school, and in graduate school, you all have to have a theorist. And that's a good thing. Many people picked Jean Watson because she's all about the theory of human caring. Yes, she is. She's all about caring. So subsequent to that, people will say, I don't know, look up Watson because you know she's all about caring. And so I can't tell you enough about her because her CV, as you know, goes on and on. So I'm going to say just a few things. But I can tell you that her book that I'm thinking about right now is Nursing the Philosophy, looking at the caring. So the philosophy and science of caring. And there's a few things I have to say that I want to not forget. One is she has 13 honorary doctorates. 11 are international. What? That's pretty incredible, right? So wait, there's more, and I just don't want to forget what I'm going to tell you. She was inducted into the Living Legend by the American Association of Nursing, and that is its highest honor. So you are very privileged to be able to hear somebody that we all regard so highly, not only in nursing, but those of us who care. Also, she held the nation's first chair position of caring science at the University of Colorado for 16 years. Wow. And lastly, she's the founder of the Watson Caring Science Institute. If I got any of that wrong, Jean, I am so sorry. But everybody, please help me welcome Dr. Jean Watson. Is that close to good?
Perfect. Good morning. So I'm sorry I've missed the rest of this conference because I know it's been delicious and wonderful for all of you. And it's fascinating to me to be here because I think, if I don't know this, that we all have a shared consciousness about this work. And so it's a special privilege to be here and share another perspective, perhaps, both from nursing but beyond nursing, and also weave it in, to some extent, my own personal experience, not a near-death experience. But then, as a sidebar, I was having a conversation with my colleague, Janet Quinn, the other day, and I was telling her about this conference. And she said, well, maybe you don't have to have a near-death experience to have a near-death experience. You don't have to be physically in a near-death. You can have a death of ego. You can have a death of self as we have known it without having the fullness of the near-death in the physical sense. So, this has some nuances that kind of bring us to another way of thinking about this, because as we evolve in our consciousness. So, with that, in terms of consciousness, one of the things I do, which is a little avant-garde, and by the way, can you hear me? If you can't, let me know, because my voice tends to drop when I get kind of dramatic or serious or something like that. But I've been using these singing bowls for some time. They're calibrated to different vibrations. And I use 3 often, but I'm just going to use one here, but I'll tell you what I use them for and what they symbolize energetically, if not scientifically and metaphorically, symbolically. The one I use most, but I don't have with me now, is for the heart. Because when we open our heart, we have a higher access to our higher consciousness. And the heart is the source of our humanity. It's the source of our truth. It's the source of our beauty. It's the source of love and compassion and caring. It all is in our heart. It's not in our head. So the second one I use is calibrated to the throat, because particularly in nursing and what we know and our disciplinary foundation, which is quite different from medical science, we have a responsibility to give voice and language to these phenomena of what you've been experiencing this week, because nurses deal with this every single day. But we don't have explanatory models to make sense out of it. And we're all in this process together of trying to find meaning and explanations for phenomena that we can't quite locate within our traditional Western worldview. But the third one I use is calibrated to the higher consciousness. And when we move to the higher consciousness in our awakeness and in our awareness, we open to these phenomena that can't be explained in the conventional sense of Western medicine. So what I'm going to do now is going to just do a little simple centering with this singing bowl, which is calibrated to our higher consciousness, so that we can energetically and experientially kind of vibrate, even though you're already there. Okay, now, I may not be able to get the sound, but I'm going to try. Life. That just breathing is a miracle. And on the out breath, just release. Just holding that still point between the breaths as you allow yourself to open to this higher consciousness. And just briefly, quietly, take a moment to breathe from your heart through your throat and up through your higher crown chakra, and visualize a light going from the heart down to the center of the earth, and from the center of the earth back up through your heart, through all your chakras, up to the higher source. And gently come back into this space. So as you come back into this space, just realize that what I'm going to say is nothing new. We already all know this. But these are just a few reminders that we are really moving into a quantum universe. You know, we're in a new world. We just haven't caught up with it. And now we have to acknowledge, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it, whether the outer world agrees with it, we are in a whole new world of connectedness and oneness. And that we share this planet Earth with all living things. And so we move from human caring to eco-caring to the higher consciousness of being connected with source of the universe. And so we now have to realize that we're not separate, that we all belong to this infinity, this field of life itself. And one of the things that I want to celebrate is the discipline of nursing has some explanatory ways of understanding what we refer to as unitary human beings, which really goes back as far as Nightingale, who was actually a mystic, a visionary, a scientist, as well as a healer. And more currently, from the 70s on, we've had a major nursing theorist who has this whole science of unitary human beings, where she made explicit that we don't have energy, we are energy. And we vibrate at different frequencies of energy. And as nursing is maturing as a distinct discipline, it is grounded in what is increasingly referred to as Unitary Caring Science, which is an entirely different model of science. And it brings with it these timeless values, this unitary worldview, if not cosmology. It brings forth a very philosophical orientation toward humanity in terms of honoring the oneness, the mind, body, spirit of the whole, and our connectedness with all. In nursing, and something is happening in the universe. I'm in a different country almost every month. And nursing has this global covenant with humanity. This is way beyond a customer model that we're so acquainted with in our systems. And yet quietly behind the scenes, for probably the last 3 to 4 decades, nursing has been developing its paradigm, its knowledge, its theories, its disciplinary foundation to inform its practice and policies and directions for humanity. But most people don't know that because nursing tends to work behind the scenes. But now we can celebrate this with audiences like this. So now we have these converging theories and knowledge and expanded research traditions that invite this whole range of epistemologies, expanded ways of knowing, and even beginning to honor what counts as knowledge. Our Western worldview doesn't allow us to count certain kinds of knowledge. But now, when we have a unitary worldview and expanded epistemology and expanded ontology, if you will, about what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to be healing, what does it mean to have a near-death experience, these are all very provocative and evocative questions that have haunted us across time and humanity across time. I regret that I wasn't here for some of the other speakers, but I did hear Eben Alexander a couple of years ago at the Aspen Institute, shortly after he had published his book. And the Aspen Institute was a brain laboratory event, a lot of scientists presenting about the brain. It was a wonderful conference because the first series was about the creative brain, which was wonderful. Walter Isaacson. The second talk was on the healthy brain. The third talk was on pathological brain. I didn't want to hear that one. And the fourth one was about the future brain. And Dr. Alexander presented the future brain. And you have heard him, so you know his, and you've read his book, I'm sure. And one of the things he said to the audience was, of all the phenomena that you're exploring you will never find the answers in the physical brain. So I'm going to shift to another view of understanding this evolution of our consciousness to take us beyond this Western concrete body physical material world to what's been referred to in medical literature and nursing literature as Era 1 thinking. Or it's also referred to as particulate deterministic thinking in some of the nursing literature. It's a paradigm that reduces everything down to the parts and keeps looking at further and further parts without making connections. And here in this worldview that we're still working our way out of, we have the material body, this complex machine. We go in and we can do something to somebody without it affecting us. And it's focused largely on doing and fixing things up rather than being part of the process. So in this westernized kind of mindset, we have reduced the person down to the body as machine model. And it's very prominent in our institutions and our institutional thinking, in subtle ways as well as overt ways. What is dramatic to me about this, without critiquing this, is that in the medical systems and in our, quote, healthcare, translated as sick care systems, we have created this following scenario. First instance, person gets reduced to patient, right? Second instance, patient gets reduced to body physical. Third instance, body physical gets reduced to machine or technology, and we're going to fix this body physical. And as soon as that happens, we have taken a whole human being, we're all whole, even with our flaws. We've taken a whole human being and we've reduced them down to the moral status of an object. As soon as we reduce another human being to the moral status of an object, guess what happens? We can justify doing something to others as object and maybe dismissing their experiences that we would never do to them as fully functioning people who we wish to honor all of the experiences of their life journey, the sacred circle of life. Not only that, we know that one person's level of humanity reflects on the other. So if the other is reduced to the moral status of object, so are you, so are we. And that's what we've created in our Western world view. We've reduced ourselves down to these moral status of objects, and so then you can justify doing something to ourselves and to each other that we would never do to ourselves if we understood that we're all one, we're all connected. So from this perspective, of course, we're still in another evolution here with our reality. And of course, I love this work of Alex Gray, which invites us to this expanded view of what does it mean to be human? We're not separate. And now we have these new visions and your own experiences, I'm sure, where your light and energy and consciousness, expanded consciousness, moving to the depths of our humanity and allowing ourselves to connect with Source, however we frame that. And so we're into this era 3, or what's referred to in the nursing literature as unitary transformative perspective. In medicine, it's referred to as era 1 thinking, or non-local transcendent consciousness thinking. And just to back up a minute about the era 1 thinking, I was dean at the University of Colorado, and while I was there, we developed the Center for Human Caring, and we were doing lots of things that were in models of healing and honoring the unity of mind, body, spirit. And I remember one of the chancellors said to me, "There's no place in an academic health science center for anything metaphysical." And I almost had to contain myself, as if we are not involved in the human spirit in terms of healthcare. And I was telling that story to Wayne Jonas several months later. And those of you who maybe know Wayne Jonas, he's a Renaissance physician who was, he's head of Samueli Research Institute. And he was at the time the first medical director of the Office of Alternative Complementary Medicine of NIH. And I was telling Wayne about the comment from the chancellor. And he said, "Oh, that's the epitome of Era 1 thinking in medicine." So, you know, there are people who know the difference, and we are evolving. And as we evolve into this other unitary field model, which I actually call caring science as sacred science, because it allows us to connect with universal source and be open to our own evolution. And we're searching still for different language, because our language is very dense and words contain energy. So even the notion of a hologram kind of invites us to think about the whole as in the part and the parts in the whole. So new metaphors are being sought to really capture this unknown, expanded dimension of where we are in our evolution as humanity. But this work also makes clear, at least in my writing, that consciousness transcends time, space, and physicality. So you can be physically present with someone and have this caring experience or having this near-death experience, and that lasts beyond that time, that specific time. You carry it with you. And even some of the works of Whitehead, he talks about the eternal now. The eternal now is those moments that you've experienced, that the time, the past, present, and future are all present in that one moment. And so this consciousness of being connected and being open, and that's holding that still point that T.S. Eliot writes about, we are omnipresent. It's infinite, it's immortal, it goes on forever. It's ultimately one. And we're in this quantum universe of awakening, and yet our systems are still structured around an industrial model, product line thinking. It's fascinating, isn't it, to see the contrast? And so we're into this consciousness where we can acknowledge this unitary being, that we all belong to this infinite field of universal love. And it allows for the evolution of our heart-centered and really a way to deepen our humanity, not to minimize it, and not to reduce us down to this moral status of an object. And so here we have this awareness, artistically, visually, metaphorically, metaphysically, revealing another dimension of our connectedness. And of course, many of you know the work of Alex Gray. And I was privileged actually to be the first nurse to really use his work. And I'll tell you the story because it's quite fascinating. Again, I was dean at the time, and I was driving between Boulder and Denver, and I heard him interviewed on public radio. And they were talking about art for the 21st century. And the name of his exhibit was at the small new Museum of Art in New York. And it was called The Sacred Mirror. And I thought, oh, I really want to see this art. And I had a trip to Washington, D.C. just a week or so later, and I changed my itinerary to make sure I went to New York after D.C. And it was an early Saturday morning, rainy, and I went there, and I was the only person in the museum. And by the way, this is a Sunday morning, and I'm amazed that you're out here. You're quite brave to come out on a Sunday morning. It's actually kind of rainy here, too. But in any event, I walked into that room that had the full exhibit of the whole series of The Sacred Mirror. And it was unbelievable in terms of the sacred experience that I had by just being in that field, that energetic field. And later, I actually made arrangements for Alex to bring his whole installation to the University of Colorado Boulder campus. And the museum there sponsored him to come and show this exhibit to the community. And we had open reception and so forth. And I remember people from the public coming to his reception and holding up their hands to his works of art because they literally could feel the light and energy from his artwork. And shortly thereafter, I started showing his work as a way to show the expansion of our consciousness and their unitary field, so to speak, of our humanity in different presentations. And I was getting calls from patients asking me, because they had seen this or heard me speak, and they wanted to know if I had any postcards or anything that I could give them of his artwork, because they wanted to meditate on it as part of their healing. So it's quite fascinating. And of course, now this has become pretty much mainstream. So let me say a couple things about the way to frame this, perhaps theoretically as well as intellectually and metaphysically. I've been influenced by the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, and he says in his writing, which is so beautiful, one of his books is called Totality versus Infinity. Like, we're here at this crossroads of humanity. We're either going to totalize humanity and destroy ourselves, or we're going to have infinite evolution. And he calls this the ethic of belonging. And he goes on to say, we all belong to this infinite field of universal cosmic love. We all come from it, and we all return to it. And it shows this whole vision and imagery of the sacred circle of life and death. And not only that, he says, the ethic of belonging is the first principle of science. Well, think of that. Talk about a new model of science. So that's what I use as a foundation for caring science. Unitary caring science is grounded in a very different worldview. It's grounded in an ethic of belonging versus an ethic of separation. And it differs from just our being by itself alone, which might be Heidegger's work, but it's really belonging. The ethic of belonging comes before the ontology of our being. It's a very powerful way of inverting the paradigm and turning everything upside down, because if that's your starting point, then you can accommodate all these other perspectives that you've experienced with the so-called near-death experience phenomena. So other principles that are related to unitary caring science is acknowledging that the human spirit is infinite, and energy is the unit of all consciousness. Everything is energy, and this is certainly the quantum universe as well. And when we evolve in our consciousness, we become more and more aware of this infinite source, which is non-local. It's not localized in our brain. And so our belonging is to this infinite field, this universal love, this evolution of consciousness, to where Teilhard Chardin talks about this evolving to the omega point. The highest point is love, or the Godhead, that we can connect with. And so then spirit and soul are one with the universe. And this is very contemporary, a recent publication of John Phillips, who's a scholar in unitary science, has just been published, making acknowledgement of some of these very same principles. So the last slide I have is a visual field to show that this is not new, this is old. This is pre-modern. This is an artwork of Hildegard of Bingen, who's 12th century. She too was a mystic, a healer, a writer, a musician, a scientist. And a lot of her work is being rediscovered for the knowledge and wisdom that she brings. And one of the things she says in her own writing is that the body resides in a field of consciousness. You see that human form there? that human form is surrounded in a field of light, and that light is open at the head, and it connects us to this infinite field. It's a way of visually, artistically, scientifically showing the imagery of non-local consciousness. That our consciousness is not localized in our brain, that we reside in this infinite field of universal love, to use Levinas's work. And so when you can understand and turn the paradigm upside down, rather than us being separate beings without these evolution of connections, in contrast to we all belong to this infinite field, and therefore we're all one and connected. Like we have this great sea of humanity, and we think we're maybe separate waves, but the sea of humanity unites us in this energetic consciousness field of love. So when you look at this artwork, you see the connection between indigenous cultures and ancient wisdom traditions across time that bring us to a new cosmology, a new worldview, a new science, a sacred science that allows us to explore and explain phenomena such as prayer, such as distant healing, such as near-death experiences, such as the evolving consciousness, such as the possibility that someone can actually have a near-death experience without having a near-death experience, if you know what I mean. For example, I had what I might call a near-death experience, but I didn't die. It wasn't like I died to have that experience. I had it because I had a major accident, and I had to be still, I mean literally quiet, for almost 3 months on a massage table to try to get my eye to heal. So I moved into this contemplative, very deep, what would I call it, mystical space. I was having biblical dreams and things that I couldn't explain. But what was really, really important for me, which led me to have more of my writing about this, is that I had an experience where I was simply love. I wasn't in love. I wasn't loved. I became a constellation of love. So in looking at Hildegard of Bingen, you can see how you can actually tap in to that field and experience that as a mystical but a very real experience that helps us to know this truth. The other thing about this story is it's rare that you can share these stories, right? But I met someone once after this happened to me, and I told him, he happened to be working with a very spiritual healer. I didn't know it at the time. And he asked me what I did. And I said, well, I'm involved in caring science, but you probably don't know what that is. And he looked at me and he says, oh, yes, I do. And then he told me a little bit about his background. And then I told him about this experience that I had. And I said, well, you know, you can go there. You have that experience. It changes you. But you don't dwell there. You can't live there all the time. And he looks at me so clearly and he said, oh, yes, you can. Oh, yes, you can. So I think once you've had this, you know it. And all I'm doing is trying to find new explanatory ways that bring this to another level. And it really comes from the roots of nursing, not necessarily medicine, because medicine is still trapped in that Era One thinking and trying to find new explanations for all this in the physical reality when it really exists in the non-physical, non-local consciousness level. So there's more I could say, but I think I'm going to pause here and let you take a moment and breathe this in and see what your comments and questions are in relation to this, and if you think I'm crazy. Okay, thank you.
Oh, yes, my dear. We know that experience of love. We had a wonderful speaker yesterday or the day before here named Yvonne Kaysen, who coined the term spiritually transformative experience to cover all of those other ways and opportunities and means of knowing what near-death experiencers know. Not head knowing, by the way, but a deeper level of knowing. So we would call yours a spiritually transformative experience. And we are trying to include much more of those experiences in the IANDS consciousness. And thank you so much for understanding and putting beautiful words to our experience.
It's very great to see you again, Jean. I've followed your work for many years and admire all that you have done. And I really appreciate taking a stand on helping to bring nursing forward as a caring profession and getting us back to the roots of really what we belong. And I'm wondering if you have some recommendations you can share with the group about how you envision we can be of support to this community in particular with our compassion and caring and attention, because many times it is a nurse who's at the forefront along with the doctor and moving the person who's experienced it in their family into the center of the paradigm of how health needs to be delivered. So are there some things you'd like to share about that?
Well, I think where we're in this is a major transition into a new worldview, and nursing has always known this, but we've not been able to give voice to it. And so I think it's not just nursing, it's coming from every discipline in the universe right now, whether we're aware of it or not. I mean, it's a quantum world that we're in, and all disciplines are having to redefine themselves. And so by nursing, honoring the reverential, sacred nature of our phenomena and of our human experiences is giving voice in a safe space without apologies, so that we can honor this unity of this experiences that people have across time. And so that's where it's coming out of the shadows into the light. And this is part of our responsibility in giving voice and language. But it does require some knowledge. It requires knowledge of a new vision of science. And that's what I think caring science and sacred science offers us. You know, from the philosophical, ethical perspective of the ethic of belonging is the first principle of science, is a powerful transformation in and of itself. Because the starting point for traditional Western science is that we are separate. We are not belonging to this infinite field. And so what happens when we have this phenomena, when the nurse or patient, or the physician or nurse or anyone enters that space with that other person, depending on our consciousness and depending upon our intentionality and our awareness, we can either cut off that person's access to their higher inner self, or we can open it up for them. So that too is part of our practices, particularly when someone is dying. It's a sacred journey back into that life-death. And one of my colleagues, Taryn Estes, is doing this major work on conscious dying, preparing people very intentionally. How do you want to die? Especially die before you die, because you know that you're returning to this infinite love. And one of my elder Native Americans that I worked with a while ago, he said to me, we all come from the spirit world, this sacred circle, and we all come here for a reason to be on the earth plane, And our reason is to fulfill our soul's journey. It might be very simple. It might be very grand as to why we're here. It might be as simple as being at the right place at the right time to help somebody across the street. But when our journey is finished on the soul level, we return home. And then he goes on to say, why is it we all love a newborn baby? We love a newborn baby because they're fresh from the spirit world. They're fresh from love. They all come from that love field. And then what happens when somebody's returning to it, we get all nervous and we get explain, or we try to explain the phenomena of a near death through all the physical brain and all of that, in contrast to allowing the sacred circle to be connected and to know that there's another reality there waiting as part of the sacred journey.
And the other thing I really appreciate that you emphasize is through your own challenge when you had to lay still for 3 months, that's when you had one of the most remarkable experiences of your life. And I think that gives additional encouragement to people when they're going through a hardship, that there can be a gift connected to that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi,
Hi.
Jean. Thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome.
A couple of part question, and as a psychotherapist, I'm really eager to hear, what are really the inroads are we making to transitioning, right? What you're trying to do, what I'm trying to do, and bringing it into the everyday, really getting it into our practice. I'd love to hear that from you. And with respect to the dying process itself, I remember when my father passed, I could tell, short story, I could tell he waited. And yes, I flew in, just coincidentally made the trip, 4 months in advance, and he wasn't even sick, he was still golfing at 90. But at the same time, I happened to get there the evening before. By 6 o'clock the next morning, he had passed. My point about that be, the days when we could pass at home and it could be a beautiful experience, but at that point, those of us left behind were all of a sudden subject to a murder investigation, of course, because there was no hospice person, there was no nurse, there was nobody in the house. And all of a sudden, we have 6 sheriffs at the house, and all of a sudden, they're coming back and they're questioning me even later throughout the day, and they're counting all the pills. So could you also maybe address that as you also tell us what are the inroads and what could each of us do to help spread this into practical reality faster?
Wow, my goodness. I don't know your specific situation, but this whole notion of when you die is when the Native Americans said to me, when Father Spirit calls, we go, whether we're ready or not, or whether we think it's time or not. And another way of thinking about this, and this is a very personal story, because my husband committed suicide. And the elder who was working with me, I was trying to be discreet because he said when it's time to go, when your soul's journey is finished, you can return home. And he said, when your soul's journey is finished, you return home. And I remember that I asked him, I said, well, what about suicide? When you go home prematurely. I said that. And he says, what do you mean prematurely? That's your word. And I said, well, like suicide. I was trying to be discreet at the time. And he said, well, in our language, and he's Ojibwa, he said, we don't have a word for suicide. It's when Father Spirit calls, you go. And there's no word for suicide. Anyway, that was one part of my story. I'll just finish it because it was quite dramatic for me. But when he said, we all go, when it's time, our soul's journey. And I remember my husband, who was this very avant-garde attorney and doing all these other things. He would go to Esalen and learn massage, and he was an artist and poet and writer and all that. So anyway, he was giving me full-body massages when I was on that massage table. And I remember one day he said to me, I feel like I've been preparing all my life just for this. It's like, wow, this is a lovely thing. But after he wasn't needed anymore, it's like, he went He was gone. He left before he left. His soul left before his body. So anyway, these phenomena happen. I don't have any answer for you for that particular, other than to honor the sacredness of this journey. And in my work, I've developed what I call the 10 Caritas processes. And they kind of capture the phenomena of human caring that are universal. And one of them, the first one, is the practice of loving kindness and equanimity with ourselves first, so that we can have that with others. And the 10th one is allow for mystery and miracles. And so we just have to allow for mystery and miracles. And that's part of the phenomenon of human caring and healing. So thank you and good luck. Yeah.
Do you have any advice then for those of us, like I said, psychotherapists, nurses, people who are out there in the field, but we're trying to integrate this into our, our work areas, and we're trying to integrate this more? Do you have any advice for us?
Well, if you use the theory of human caring, it will guide you for your practice. It really will. These 10 Caritas processes will guide you. And one of the processes is really authentically listening to another person's story. Like, listening to another person's story is often maybe the only thing you need to do to honor their experience. And we can make explicit in ourselves, in our own consciousness, that whatever anybody experiences, it's real. It's real. We cannot judge that. If somebody's experienced that, that's their story. And anyone's story could be anyone else's story. That's the other side of this work. Thank you. I get dramatic about this. Sorry. Hi.
I'm not going to ask a question, but make an observation or comment. Your presentation, I would say the problem with Western medicine is not only separates spirit and the body, it further divides everything into specialties, which is really bad in treating the whole person. In my experiences with a child of mine who has epilepsy, and who I have to go to 3 different people to treat her, a psychologist, a neurologist, and just the general health practitioner. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. The left hand affects the right hand. And there's a lot of arrogance, I would say, amongst doctors, a lot of doctors, and they don't listen, and they don't realize the therapy they're giving that they're so proud of is affecting other aspects of the body or the psyche. The medications, brain surgery, the therapies that they push. It's really frustrating as a parent, and a lot of times they ignore the family who's trying to explain what's happening to a child or to their loved one. And they really dismiss you, and so I think there's way too much in the Western mind to compartmentalize, to divide, and to try to specialize everything when it's very integrated, and that needs to change.
Well, and also nursing has this integrated view, and the future directions for healthcare is literally to go to healthcare, not just sick care. And so some of the projects I'm working with the hospitals all over are really to transform nursing from the inside out through this new consciousness, through attention to wholeness, to consciousness, to caring, to these relationships, to meaning, the meaning that the person has.
They have to stop separating into fields and specialties and talk to each other, because what one doctor is doing is affecting another part of the body or another part of the brain. Which, you're giving something to stop a seizure, but it's causing immense depression, or it's causing not able to thrive because it's appetite suppressant. And the doctors themselves are in denial of the side effects. They really are.
That, again, is the worldview of their view of science, is what's influencing their reality. Our starting point will dictate where you end up. And I remember years ago, Artie Lang, who's a psychiatrist, psychobiologist, psychologist, existential psychologist, he said, if your focus is on the whole human being and all your experiences and vicissitudes of humanity, and your starting point is the biological organism, your starting point will dictate where you end up. And if your starting point is this biological organisms for the whole human being and all the vicissitudes of our human experience, he says it's like trying to make ice by boiling water. You can't get there. You cannot get there to where we're talking about if our starting point continuously is this basic physical material plane of our existence. It's that simple. And so our starting point has to be this ethic of belonging. That's why I'm so attached to Emmanuel Levinas, a French philosopher, with his ethic of belonging as the first principle of science. Hi.
So I'm a neuroscientist who started out, as you're saying, at that particular place of separation. And
Of course.
I think my question is that for me, it didn't change until I had a spiritual experience that then showed me a whole different worldview. And when I want to share this with my scientific colleagues, they haven't had that experience. And so they stay in their place of separation. And I think one of the things I'm trying to understand as a teacher, a professor as well, teaching pre-med students, is that they are only trained and they've only experienced separation, and so they treat the body as a machine.
Right, exactly.
How can we, earlier on perhaps in education, or can we, do you have to have a spiritual experience of some sort to be able to see a whole view, or is there a way of educating people from the very beginning, in kindergarten even, to have a different view of the world, which is what you're talking about?
Well, now children are starting to learn to meditate at a very early age, depending on the culture they're in. So, by having access to the higher source from the heart above, it's when we are not from the heart above. When we shut our hearts down, we're shutting down the source of all of our humanity. And this research on the heart, and I've been doing work with Heart Math Institute, is acknowledging that the heart sends more messages to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. So when we open our heart and can meditate on this evolution, we're connecting to higher source, and you can actually have that transcendent experience without having to die to get there if you practice. So it's a journey, and some people have had the experience through near death, or they've had it through their own transformative, whatever enlightenment was. That was what I was saying. You might have a near death without having to go through the near death. And it sounds like you've had that. So this too is part of this awakening, let's say. Thank you. But let me just finish in terms of nursing and academics. Many nurses and nursing faculty, even nursing deans, I'm sorry, I'm being very candid here, often do not know the discipline, the foundation of the discipline. And when you go back and study the discipline and all these principles that talk about wholeness, consciousness, caring, meaning, purpose, you have a different paradigm. And you cannot locate yourself in those lower level paradigms when you're dealing with phenomena that are the higher level. That's that transformative, transcendent. And that's what nursing has to wake up to, and that's why academic nursing is important to help provide the literature and understanding of this work as well as the practices. So my next book is coming out. It's called Unitary Caring Science, the Philosophy and Praxis of Nursing, not just the science. Anyway, that's an aside. Thank you.
Just thought I'd mention, you mentioned earlier about the death of the ego. It doesn't have to be near death. Well, one of the pioneers in this field, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, her model of the 5 stages to depression, depression, bargaining. I get them. Anyway, they sometimes use them in things like divorce recovery and a lot of other situations. Right. That those 5 situations apply. I don't know. That's just sort of a comment, but you can comment on it also.
Absolutely, but we also know they're not linear. They go back and forth. They're kind of more circular, even though we do have those as a way to anchor that phenomena, which moves into that healing process. Hi.
Thank you. I think the whole philosophy is so broad, it is so beautiful. But I find myself just a little bit turned off by words.
Yes.
And I'm sitting here and I'm just transfixed by that picture. And I'm thinking of myself, as a 17-year-old walking into a school of nursing, and just being overwhelmed by all this technology and science and all this sort of stuff and being really, really scared, But if I could have looked at a picture, it would have been the 1,000 words. And I think how when I sat in the Chicago Museum and saw what's the artist? Anyway, his mother and child, and it was just a pencil drawing, just a pencil drawing, and I sat there for maybe half an hour and just felt, and I didn't know what I was feeling or what I was experiencing, but I was changed. And so I think, you know, the philosophy needs to come down more into the picture form. In the hospital, in our little town of Penticton, and also in the neighboring where there's a bigger one, the doctors started art in the hallways, and people are being invited, and one of the near-death experiencers who's painting the light that he saw, his pictures are going to go up in the hallway. And so in answer, you know, how do we get this? You know, there's an easier way into the subconscious to just begin the opening, like if a doctor could walk into a medical school for the first time and see that picture, you know, he might look at the whole curriculum differently, and I know they want to now. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you, I appreciate that. It's like we have other ways of knowing besides just in our head and our language. Hi.
Hi. What she just said is kind of a good segue into what I was thinking as I was hearing all of what you say. And I think the only way that a real change can come about in this is if, say for example, meditation is integrated into the curriculum of nursing and of education in the medical field.
Exactly.
If it's integrated in, it becomes one of the aspects of curriculum, then it can develop naturally in such a way that, you know, people will realize and they will be able to hear experientially what you're saying and what we all know needs to happen.
Exactly.
But unless it is literally a part of a curriculum, I don't know how it can completely come together.
Thank you, because we know that there's so much attention to technological competencies and scientific competencies, but there's rare attention to what I call ontological or human competencies about being human, and that's where we have to change our pedagogies and change our whole curriculum. And that too, as part of a caring science curriculum, would bring in the arts and the humanities very systematically. And I remember hearing Larry Dossey a few years ago, and one of the things he said that even medicine now, the future of medicine will be less about diagnosis and more about meaning. What is the meaning that this experience has for people? And what is the meaning a student's learning is about? If we're only just giving them the content and filling them up with facts without having an experiential component, there has to be a combination of intellectual experiential experiences, and that's what a caring science curriculum is about. As nurses, take responsibility for this in universities and in colleges of nursing as well as in practice. So this is a total transformation. Yes, hi.
I just want to acknowledge you and also give an offering here. First of all, I'm going to make sure any nursing client of mine that doesn't know you is recommended to you, so thank you. I talk to angels. I have nothing to do with the medical profession. My father's a physicist, so I'm born and bred in the scientific model. But here's an offering. Marjorie asked about how do you teach this to people who have not had spiritually transformative experiences. Since we know that athletes, when they do visualizations, activate the same areas of the brain, there is science showing that visualizations create the same experience. So what I've done is I've created a guided journey that takes people into the light. And people who have never experienced anything like this come out of it crying because they've been into the light. And I did this with a dying lady once. And I thought she was going to take off and leave because she went into the light and I was with her. You know how we go together in the shamanic realms. And she comes back. She'd been scared of dying. She's got a big grin on her face. She's like, is that what it is? Yeah. And she died peacefully the next day after a long drawn-out illness. So I believe we can take people into the experience, not talk about it only, but give them a little science so they understand that their brains will simulate, and then maybe just actually journey them into it possibly. And it might be useful to help people prepare for dying.
Beautiful. Thank you. Hi.
Hi. I'm a psychiatrist in private practice, and a number of my patients are nurses. And I have been thinking for a while now that nurses need support. This is such a difficult time to be in the, the hospital scene. and it so much falls on them, and their humanity is absolutely key. People totally rely on their humanity, and yet they need so much support and help. You know, I think of them as what Bruce Lipton calls imaginal cells, that as we move into an evolution in our worldview and from materialism to greater consciousness, that we need people to be imaginal cells and that others will learn from them. So I'm really puzzling over how I can offer some type of workshops for nurses, and I think there's something there that, you know, that could be really helpful.
Absolutely.
You probably have a lot of ideas about how that could work.
Well, we do have programs through my institute. One of them is called the Caritas Coach Educational Program, and it's a 6-month program where all different levels of practitioners go through it, and you go through in-depth experiences as well as the intellectual knowledge of these processes. And the other thing that relates to this art is that the work of David Hawkins, some of you probably know, is he says, because we're in a unitary field now, if any one person expands in their consciousness to this higher field, it's affecting the whole field of all of humanity. Mm-hmm. And see, my position is there are 19.3 or 6 million nurses in the world. If just nurses alone captured this higher consciousness under this understanding of the unitary field, we could change the world. Or anyone who's participating in this. And that's why it always goes back to self.
Yes.
That we all have to do it here. We
That's
can't
right.
say you got to do it and you got to do it. We do it, and then it radiates beyond. And I'm doing these projects with hospitals right now. And one of the experiences I had when I first started, probably about 20 years ago, I was working with a very dark system, and they wanted to do this caring science theory in nursing practice. And I had a mentor with whom I was working at the time, and I was talking about how dark the institution felt to me. And he says, well, Jean, don't you know, when you bring in the light, you're going to reveal more of the darkness. So all this that we're experiencing, about when we're bringing in light to humanity right here with this work, and we're going to be seeing more of the dark, but it's going to put more light on it so that we can do something about it. And it starts back with us. That's that first Caritas process.
Yes.
Practice of loving kindness and equanimity with ourselves so that we can have it with others and honor
Right.
all these vicissitudes of our existence.
Right. So I think nurses
Thank
are
you.
going to change
You'd
the
be
world of medicine.
wonderful. Well, but do your work. I mean, I think if you do a workshop, it's absolutely
Yeah.
fabulous.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks so much for your
Thank
work.
you.
Okay, just a quick announcement before we have this next question is we're going to have an auction right after this ends. We have 2 tickets for the Eben Alexander Karen Newell workshop tonight, and you might get a deal.
Hello.
Hi, Jean. One of the things that has come to me as we go through the conference, it's very me-ism. Now, the nurse goes and, what about the nursing of other parts of the circle of life? See, what about the green world? What about the world of animals? And they need nursing too.
Absolutely.
And our whole planet needs some nursing. Otherwise, we're not going to be here. Well,
You're absolutely right.
some of us, of course, are going shortly, but yeah, I fear for my great-granddaughter, who's 2 now, and I think, oh, God, what is going to happen?
Well, the starting point for this work is self, and it radiates to other, all the way out to the planet, all the way out to the universe. And I was at a conference. It was an invited world leader conference in Iceland a couple of years ago, and it would have businessmen. It wasn't about healthcare. It was about all sectors of society. Bank presidents, head of BMW International with something like a $36 billion budget. But they were all there because they were acknowledging, and these are world presidents as well, President of Iceland and so forth. And they were there because they were acknowledging what you're saying, that we cannot survive as humans or a planet unless we return to values of caring and compassion and love. That was the whole theme of that conference, for sustaining our humanity. And that's why caring science is sacred. Science is a very different model of science, has a very different ethic, has a different cosmology, and we all can learn and work in this together because that's what the world is calling for, or we may not survive.
I think of the prairie dogs that we have around here. They're part of the circle of life. I don't know that they need any nursing at the moment, but
It's beyond nursing.
if we nurse in a larger sense,
right.
then we
Right.
can do something for them, perhaps.
Absolutely. And I think it's beyond nursing. I'd use nursing because that's my field, but it really is beyond nursing. And one of my books is called Postmodern Nursing and Beyond, because it's beyond, it's about your humanity. It's not just about nursing.
I sometimes think that the whole conference, they want to go international. They should be should have a wider field besides the near-death experience. That we should start moving out from.
I see what you're saying. Well, that's for the conference people too.
Yeah, that's for the conference people.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. God bless. Mm-hmm.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I admire your work, but I go back to the time where I was 19, and I want to do something. The doing. I graduated from an ADN. Years of practicing nursing, then I realized I like the being. When I teach, because I'm a clinical associate professor at South Texas, I told my student, when you enter to the door at the hospital, you enter the field. And by the way, I saw the movie of this beautiful nun.
Beautiful.
You know, the eyes
lovely.
of God and the
Yes.
channeling she does is beautiful. Entering the field, the art of observation, you see health. Please, if you're going to be my nurse, you're better to have the feel and the consciousness of health. Otherwise, you have no place in the space of where I am want to be. So if any client, you're coming as a patient, you need to get, because it starts with you. What I would like to see is sustainability of caring. United Nations is working on, a different team, but if you can put caring, sustainability of caring.
Exactly.
Another task for you, because you're so good on that.
That's what I'm doing with all these hospitals that I'm working with.
Not sustaining, but sustainability of caring, which we integrate what is talking about, that it's the life, the cycle of life.
Exactly, the sacred circle.
But yeah, on that part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Hi.
Hi, Jean. Thanks for being here. I just wanted to see if you could repeat when you had said that the person is reduced to a patient,
Sure.
and the patient is,
Sure.
if you'll
Right,
repeat that.
Well, these scenarios that we're all kind of seduced by, unconsciously or if not overtly. I'll wait till you get there so you can take notes if you want. First instance, we all know this. Person gets reduced to patient. Second instance, patient gets reduced to body physical. Third instance, body physical gets reduced to machine or technology, and we are there to do things to this person and fix them up. And as soon as you have that spiraling downward without critiquing it and interrupting it, we have taken a whole human being and we have reduced them to the moral status of an object. So the dangers of reducing someone to a moral status of an object goes back to Levinas's philosophy, because he talks about totality versus infinity. We either totalize the person and cut them off from that excess. We totalize them down to the moral status of an object. And as soon as that happens, you can justify doing something to others' object you would never do to them as a fully functioning person. That's why we have problems in the world today with, other races and people that are not like us. They're like reduced to the moral status of an object. So then we can distance and do something to them because they're not they're not like us, so to speak. So that danger then is danger, just back to the other gentleman, of totalizing all of humanity. And then you can justify it because you are doing something to other that you would never do to yourself. Because you see yourself as separate and different. You're separate versus connected. Hi.
Hi. Being reduced to an object, there's even a lower level to be reduced to a product.
To be puppets?
No, to be reduced to a product.
To a product, exactly. Yeah. To be bought and sold. There's a whole commodification of caring. Like, these hospitals, they're carrying this and carrying that as if it's something. But I use the word caritas very specifically because it brings caring and love together and the energy of love. And now we know, even from some of the research institutes, that love is posited, at least now, as the greatest source of all healing. Because when you have a definition of healing as being back in right relation with Source, you line up with Source, which is love. What is the highest level of consciousness? Is love. So when we evolve in our consciousness, we get connected with love, universal love. Yes.
I'm curious how you see, once this would take hold a little more into the future, how do you see the sick care changing? For instance, if a patient is in the hospital and they're treated in this manner through nursing, do you think that things such as surgeries and the treatments that a patient would receive, that will change, that there may be more time in between instead of going directly into a surgery, waiting for the body to sort of get into a better place, that it may have a better outcome after the surgery? How do you see all of that working?
Well, if you project yourself, if we astro project ourselves, 100 years from now and look back on this time, we would see this time as very barbaric because we're still seeing just physical reality. But in reality, there's energy. Once you begin to, even you see clues of it, laser medicine, laser surgery, et cetera, et cetera. These are trends that are showing us that the body is all energetically capable of healing itself if we have the right consciousness and the right approach, and we have enough evolution of our humanity to get us there. And this is what I was at this conference in Saudi Arabia, and I was astonished with this one woman who, John Kerry had been to consult with her, and the head of Google and Facebook and so forth, because she's this visionary, and she was showing slides of all this secret research that's going on about the energetic field of the body and healing. To one of the slides was getting into like an MRI machine, and you were energetically put back into right relation, and you jump out of it and you're healed. These are the kinds of things that have been experimented in ways that we don't even know yet. But it sets up a whole different scenario for humanity. You have the teeming masses down here, and then you have all this high-level evolution. So it's going to be an interesting journey for all of us and all of humanity. So thank you. But at another very concrete level, I might just respond that what I have been doing in the last 20, 30 years, I've been working very intensely with different hospitals. And some of it happened because of the Magnet initiatives, which is a national credentialing system where hospitals have to show new criteria of standards for nursing in the hospitals, and they have to have a nursing theory or a nursing model to show their practice transformation. And so I have a whole network of hospitals that I'm working with very intensely, again, behind the scenes, not under medicine, but under the nursing model to really bring nurses into this caring process and the caring science as their practices, and it's very transformative. And some of the hospitals that we're working with right now are like these major, like Stanford University is one of our hospitals, healthcare, Brigham Women's is part of Harvard, several of the VA hospitals are working with me, what else? This Einstein in Philadelphia, a whole network of hospitals in Kaiser Permanente in Northern California, all 21 service areas. I've systematically, for the last 6 years, been working to transform nursing from the inside out. And when you transform nursing, it's the largest health profession. It's going to transform the whole system, because if you have a unitary field, if you change any one part of the field, you're going to affect the whole field. So these are things that are happening, along the way, just because this is where it needs to be done. So whoosh. Thank you for
I
your-
have to ask a question or tell a
Certainly.
story or something. When we're talking about future of nursing and how we can impact each other, this is something, and I think I can get through it without being tearful. When you look at what other people are doing, there are two nurses that I do some real hospice and palliative care things. And so whenever the question was asked about what can we do, and we see patients being traumatized by machines, and especially my critical care self sees all that go on. Well, there was two nurses that I saw that have a baby in between them, and they're kissing the baby on one side of the cheek and the other. They've just adopted this baby because she is dying. So literally, they are adopting a baby to help her die peacefully. And I thought, damn, I really want to do something. And you know how we have the elderly in homes and places that we can care for them. What are we doing about babies when you see them and their parents are completely incapable and unable to take care of their dying process? So I just want to offer that for people who are thinking, what the heck else can I do? Well, how about people dying and helping them like babies?
Well, again, this program that we endorse, it's called Conscious Dying. And it really invites people in. It's not just nurses, it's for lay people, it's for anyone who's the public, who's interested in becoming doulas, for helping someone go back through the sacred circle of life and death. So you might want to, there's information on my website if you want to follow that up. So, thank you for your attention and your kind remarks and your very provocative and helpful remarks. And it's a pleasure for me to be with you, and I thank you very much, and namaste. God bless.
Thank you, Jean.